Now, I'm going to open up this meeting, and then I'm going to hand over to our chairs of the AI study group, Dave and Matthew, and our chair of the OpenChain project itself, Jimmy. But before we get to their more than competent hands in terms of running this workshop, there's some little bits of context setting and administration to get into. The first and perhaps most important starting point is that this is a Linux Foundation meeting, and therefore it's under our antitrust policy notice. The full Linux Foundation antitrust policy can be found on the website, and if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, with that out of the way, it's time to get into the actual workshop itself. And this is a provisional agenda. As usual with OpenChain, we have the ability for things to evolve. We have the ability for people to ask questions and so on. But to set context, OpenChain is very interested in how we build trust in the supply chain and how we manage the business processes in it. The topic of AI has become very important to a great many companies in the supply chain, and trust about AI is something that is hotly discussed and debated at this juncture. How do we create trust in the supply chain in this domain? OpenChain started a study group to address this a little while back, just at the beginning of this year. So I guess, gosh, a month and a half ago. And the purpose has been to kick around the topics and find out if we can tie things together, coalesce some of these concerns into a series of points that can then be used to create solutions. Now, we're not being normative about what solutions are most appropriate and effective. What we're trying to do is define the problem and then talk about addressing it. This workshop is the culmination of the last few calls and ideas being shared around, trying to tease out the key issues in AI compliance. How do you manage AI? How do you build trust around AI in the supply chain? When it comes to what we do today, this is a long workshop and it's intended to get stuff done. This is intended to take the last few weeks of sharing thoughts and ideas, go through them, have domain experts talk in depth, and come out of this with a coherent and clearer picture of what can and what perhaps must be done in this area moving forward. There's going to be, some opening comments coming formally from our chairs of this particular meeting, and they'll set proper context for what precisely they're going to do today. But before we hand over to the chairs of the AI study group, what I wanted to do was to bring in Jimmy, the chair of the OpenChain project, to lend a few thoughts of his own around why this topic is interesting and perhaps some of his hopes for what we might accomplish in this area. As for myself, I'm on standby as always to serve the interests of this community, and I'll be following up on the outcomes of this meeting to share them with our community and to support the work of the AI study group as we move towards next steps. Whatever happens here in this workshop will feed into strategy of the OpenChain project. On the 26th of March, we have a governing board meeting and we have a steering committee meeting happening adjacent to it. In other words, just later this month, we'll have a formal mechanism to take things like the outcomes of this meeting and get the platinum members and the governing board of the OpenChain project discussing what they can do to lend a hand. I will not be present for all of the workshop because it is very late here in the Far East, but I will be following up with you all after. And the more than capable hands of Jimmy, Dave, and Matthew will guide work. Now, yes, it's here where Jimmy, I call you in and I ask you, if possible, to share just a couple of thoughts about you know, what you think is the reason that this is important to us, and what you'd like to see as chair come out from this workshop and more generally from the AI study group.
Thank you, Shane, for that opening. And I don't think anyone is expecting you to stick around for the entire call, considering the late hour. It's very welcome that you're here to open the stage, open the call and set the stage for us in such a good way. And as chair of the governing board, I just want to express my gratitude to Dave and Matthew for arranging this and really sort of taking lead initiative on the AI topic. I think it's extremely timely to have the AI topic and already at this stage discuss how do we create trust in the AI supply chain and the open source aspects of AI. What can we even have a common understanding of what the problems are and how to manage them? And if we can do that, I think we have gained a tremendous amount as sort of an industry and as individuals simplifying all of our work. To me, it's no small amount of my day is taken up with various aspects of how we will roll out AI, how we will use AI, and then of course, what are the risks related to this? How do we do compliance in this area? How will we work with this practically? It's so, and I don't think it's just me. I think many of us share sort of the same problems or the same questions. Thus, it's good that we can come together in this forum to share views, ideas, experiences, and perhaps together, hopefully after this meeting, come out a little bit wiser all together. Thanks. Handing over to Dave and Matthew.
I'll go next, Jimmy. So thank you all for joining. I'm hoping to get a lot out of this call. I just have 2 slides to summarize. We have had these study groups going for a number of weeks now, and it's clear to me that there's been a lot of discussion around what good AI compliance looks like in terms of white papers and consultations, and there have been plenty of people bring good information to this study group from various jurisdictions. But what has become apparent to me is there's lots of good discussions, and it's probably time for us to move to the next phase, which is starting to capture these ideas that what good looks like in building trust in our ecosystem. At the start of the AI study group, we kind of defined what we thought our scope was, and we can still tweak that. But we had the consensus of really wanting to define principles on how we can build trust in the ecosystem in around AI. So not just the use of AI, but actually building AI models in open source projects. And there is, as I said, plenty of literature out there, plenty of jurisdictions trying to cover key points. But we have a great opportunity here at OpenChain to be interdependent of governments, where we can go across the whole globe, the whole ecosystem, and not be limited to certain jurisdictions, to try and agree principles on what good looks like. So when I am sharing a product with one of our partners, if it's got AI in there, if we've got these list of principles. We also touched on, what does our industry need, and we started highlighting certain key topics around transparency and understanding bias, but we didn't really get into too much detail. I will just show one more slide, which was from Dave, which I think is a good slide that kind of highlights the different areas that we can dig down into building good trust. So if we're just a user is using AI, or is a company building a whole model, is there data sets involved? And we might want to consider different aspects of trust in different parts of the process of using AI. And we touched on that in some of the AI study group sessions, but now is time to bring that all together and start capturing things. I'll hand over to Dave before we open up.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those comments, by Shane, Jimmy, Matthew. Appreciate that introduction. So let me share a different window. It's going to have the same presentation. Okay, let me know if the share comes up.
Yeah, we can see that, Dave.
Yeah, okay, all right, great. All right, so for this workshop, I mean, we've been talking about different aspects of AI within the study group for a little bit, and I think the views, as summarized by Matthew, they've been excellent, very diverse, and the problem that I think we're facing is that there's so much going on out there, and as I think everybody here can appreciate, it's multidisciplinary, just like open source. You bring a technical discipline into the equation. You also need to bring a legal discipline, or at least a licensing discipline, into the equation in order to achieve what we've traditionally thought of as good compliance. And within the AI space, it's very much akin to like the early days of open source. And if you don't have gray hair like me, the upshot of that is everybody back then was creating their own licenses. Everybody was kind of creating their own frameworks. They weren't really looking at other people, referentially. They were thinking, okay, these are the things that I have in front of me as to my discipline, whether they're sort of like coming from a more technical or more legalistic background. And the various camps weren't actually getting aligned, and as a result, you had a proliferation of licenses. And even when you had that, then that just made things more complicated, simply because complying with all those licenses all at once was becoming difficult. And then a few years into that, we started to see like good common denominators, and those common denominators basically boil down to most licenses. Most licenses were requiring attribution of some kind. Some licenses on top of attribution had additional conditions, such as copyleft terms, but they were kind of analytically layerable, so you can add things on top. And that modularity for implementation created the opportunity for us to have a common discourse facilitated by OpenChain, to say, what are the most essential elements of compliance that are going to be more universal? And then once we had that, then we'd be like, what are the things that we need in terms of practices to create better efficiency within the ecosystem, whether you're sitting early in the chain, supply chain, or whether you're in the middle, or whether you're late in it, such as just an end user. And as a result, we basically went through this journey together and arrived at basically this distillation that we call OpenChain, the specification. And I do wonder whether or not, we're at a moment where we're ripe to be able to do that kind of distillation and find those common denominators, because as you'll see from the presenters today, and by the way, these aren't really presentations. These are more like, conversation starters. So as a workshop, let's have as much dialogue as possible. But we're going to have Brian Adams, who's been working on AI models, deeply, and his background is legal, but he also has a deep technical knowledge in this area, simply, based on just the osmosis of working with the engineers on this stuff. And then Jeff Kettle, who's going to be providing a dialogue on the data set aspects of this. So we'll start off with AI models, and then we'll come in with data sets. And then we like to have, conversation as we go, but then we're going to have, at the end, we're going to make a shot at what are the ways that OpenChain can best provide value to the ecosystem. And if you have early ideas, that fit into any portion of this conversation that we have here, just jump in, okay? You don't have to wait till the very end for possible solutions. So with that, let's approach this conversation with an open mind, an open dialogue, and see where this takes us with the workshop. And we'll, of course, make an attempt to capture these comments and summarize it without reference to who's saying what. By the way, we'll be following that framework as well. Okay, with that, let me pass it to Brian to get us kicked off.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Sorry, folks, I'm a little bit under the weather here, so I'm gonna stay off camera. But as Dave mentioned, a lot of this is really meant just to be a springboard for discussions. And so please chime in if you've got questions or comments. I think that's probably the most efficient use of our time here. And this first slide, I know we've touched on this briefly, but I just want to kind of go over the sort of the backdrop that this whole conversation is happening. While we know that the industry has certain obligate or expectations from one another, and there are internal policies and that sort of the thrust of the supply chain, there's this external facade of the various regulations around the world that really, I think, do color sort of the priorities of companies and of folks in supply chains. Right now, we're close to tracking those in the EU, the US, and China. There's others, I'm sure that there'll be an ever-growing list here. And I think one important thing to point out here is that these regulations, while they're dealing with the same topic, really approach things very differently. So in the EU, there's a risk-based approach where the focus or question one is, what is this model doing? And then from there, it cascades into various compliance requirements. Similarly, in China, there's a focus on how does a model behave? Is it behaving in a permissible fashion, or is it behaving in a way that's not permitted? And in the U.S., there's sort of a mix of everything else we're seeing around the globe, where it's based upon sort of the technical powers of a model and what kinds of disclosure and reporting is needed to the various governments to be a member of good standing. And I think it's important to think about these in the context of the various ways that an actor might be engaging with an AI model. So if someone is simply using a model, they're probably going to be having less concerns with the regulatory, but they're probably going to have a greater concern with what their supplier is able to provide to them, so that they know what they're using. Conversely, if you're providing models, you probably very much are concerned with these regulations to make sure that you are in compliance. And so you have both the regulation, and then you've also your downstream customers who would be interested in understanding how your technology works. We can move to the next slide.
Before we do, Brian, do you think that's a distinguishing feature that we can focus our principles along the lines of model, non-model use cases?
Could you tell me more about that, model versus non-model?
Well, you were saying there, if you are using a model, you're going to be less concerned about what regulators think and more about suppliers. But if you're creating the model, then you're going to be more interested in what the regulators are going to be putting down on you. So therefore, do we say that there are certain principles that a standard could have around a model versus, say, the use of a model?
Yeah, I think it's something important, something we should definitely consider. And this, the Turing event here is this notion of providing a model. Whether that's making it publicly available as open source, or if it's providing it to a downstream customer, or if it's providing it to the public as a service. I do think it's an important factor we should consider.
Can I just ask a question related to that? So are we considering mostly this use case of providing a pre-trained model? I'm asking because some providers might want to offer the a way for users to train the model as well. So in the diagram that you showed, Matthew, earlier, it was mostly the user is interacting at inference time, but they might also interact at training time. And this might be a problem where, for example, the provider no longer has full control over the data that's being used, because the user can also add their own data. And where does the liability fall there, or where does the burden of trust belong to in that case?
That's an excellent point. I think we should take note of that. It does seem like it's a different discussion if someone is providing a full-fledged top-to-bottom AI system, as opposed to maybe a foundational model that's going to be fine-tuned by folks downstream or further manipulated. Yeah, I think we should pencil that in as something to keep track of.
Any other comments? I think you're about to move to the next slide, Brian.
Great. So on this slide, this is sort of just talking about the interplay with open source and proprietary as it pertains to models. So I've listed a couple of factors up here that a lot of players in the industry have made both internal and external statements and commitments to how their models behave and what kind of information they can provide folks in their supply chain about their models. And I think one thing I want to comment on is you've seen the appetite wax and wane over the last year on various aspects of this. And this is informed by the regulations, as I mentioned. It's informed by litigation. It's informed by community standards that are always evolving. I guess the question I want to mostly pose here is, from an open chain perspective, do we think we need to have a two-tiered model for open source proprietary, or does it make sense to have a standard that would be broadly applicable? And I think the best analogy might be like security vulnerabilities, that they exist in both, and they have similar problems, similar solutions. So I just want to put that out to the group. One other key factor that I don't have listed here is this idea of intended and prohibited uses for models. So again, going back to the regulatory backdrop, there are certain uses that are considered high risk, and companies want to make sure that their models are not used for them. They also might do this because they just want to have a good customer experience, and they might want to disclose that, this model works great for use case A, it does not work well for use case B. Please don't do it for use case B. We're seeing that this is not only being handled through advisory statements, but also contractual clauses that say you are prohibited from doing X or Y. And on the open source side, this is also popping up with pretty great frequency on the open source side for models. For example, we're seeing the Open Rail license that has an appendix of prohibited use cases. And while there could be a whole discussion about how these licenses with use restrictions interplay with the open source definition, the truth of the matter is that this is the reality of the open source licenses of AI models today, and something that we need to grapple with.
If we go back to the open source versus proprietary point, my initial gut reaction is not to delineate between the two, with OpenChain being a slightly higher principled matter. Yes, the majority of our focus is around open source projects, but each of us, or the majority of us, comes from companies providing proprietary information, proprietary products. I think we should hold our standards to the same level. I don't see any difference. I'm getting nods in the room here. I don't know whether other people agree.
Yeah, I think that does make sense.
And I look to people who've worked in OpenChain for many more years than me, but things like the licensing standard, do we call out open source versus proprietary in that?
I think we say that the standard is applicable to software that may contain open source.
So I infer from that sentence, Jimmy, that no, we don't distinguish between open source or proprietary. You could use that standard for open source projects or proprietary projects.
Sorry, I should correct my earlier statement. In the current version, it states that it's software containing or consisting of open source. I can't remember the exact wording, but the proposal for the update of the standard is that it may contain open source, to include that, you know, your process and your principles are applicable still. If you end up with software that for some reason doesn't contain open source, that doesn't invalidate sort of the work you have done up until that point. That might be that the software could still be, or the development process that could still be OpenChain conformant, even if the end product doesn't contain any open source. That's not that shouldn't be a requirement, at least in the updated specification, but that's more of a clarification, I believe.
This might be something we could flesh out in the next, few minutes if people want to carry on this conversation, open source versus proprietary, and see if we can come to some form of decision to say, yes, we will distinguish between the two, or no, we won't. Anyone want to add anything to it?
I think there's some nuance that we need to get to on this. I think so if you look at like open source, if you have components of open source, I'm thinking about transparency pieces. Okay, people are using the word transparency in different ways, so it's almost like we need a definition of what we mean by that. But there are some people that go beyond just like disclosing, call it like how to use the model information, and which is a type of transparency. But a lot of it goes to like details, like what are the weights, what are the training data sets, and there's going to be a subset of things that, call it commercial vendors, are not going to be in as good a position as providing detail on, whether it's about preserving some type of competitive advantage, or maybe there's even some areas where there's practices around intentional obscurity that goes against transparency, and then there's also legal issues around. We can get into this in the data set conversation, but there's legal issues around whether or not there's copyright risk introduced, by being particularly transparent about training data sets, and sometimes that can be correlated with some output, risk as well. So, excuse me. So I think we need to get down to the detail as to what we mean by the same, like the same level. But I like the idea of us trying to look for a common denominator between the two.
I would like to add something.
Let's just talk a bit.
I would like to add something on that, because last time we also touched on the topic of transparency, and I believe it might be easier to tackle in practice if we first define the criteria of trade secrets, because as you say, there can be a lot of technical opacities, and if every company defines a different principle of trade secret, for example. So if we could filter out the information that won't be eligible for trade secrets, then we'll have an easier understanding of what information can be traceable and audited, and how the audit can be conducted.
I think that's a thoughtful observation, that trade secrets, it's not some monolithic thing, that it's that there's aspects of things where it's like, it's, even though it's not something that would be typically disclosed, it might be it might be reasonable that there's some lesser secret trade secrets that that can be filtered out. Yeah, I think that's a thoughtful point. Are there particular areas that you're thinking about, like, are you thinking like data sets or security issues or like testing protocols, or was there an aspect that was particularly of interest?
Yes, from my personal standpoint, knowing all the controversies with copyright law and etc., I think companies could hardly use the exemption of trade secrets to say that they won't share any hint of the training data they used to train models. I don't know if that would be illegal necessarily, but I can see how it could be unethical. I think there should always be some way to identify the training data set. And for example, some overview of the programming language of the people as developers, for example, to see that if it was any bias in the value chain. So I believe if we could find some general criteria of what is considered a trade secret within AI modeling, what will be like, I can see how it be implemented in terms of a structural design, for example, but I don't see how it can be used for training data sets.
Sorry, can you say that last sentence again? What can't be used for training data sets?
I can see how a trade secret will protect elements of the structural design of an AI modeling, for example, ways to make it more efficient, but I don't see how it can protect a training data set, especially knowing all the controversies for copyright and text and data mining.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about the use case. Let me pause. Actually, I've been talking a lot. Other people want to jump in?
Perhaps, I don't know how this works in general, but perhaps companies should be able to give assurances that their data sets are not obtained by infringing copyright in some way. Even if they're either not open source and with permissive license, or entirely proprietary, produced in-house, and potentially have some kind of way of auditing that maintains their confidentiality.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's speaking as a company that's actually working with some of those ideas that you just mentioned. The idea of training a model on proprietary stuff, the stuff that is like confidential, that should be staying behind the firewall, and then deploying that still behind the firewall. I think that's an approach that works well, that skirts those issues that we're talking about, simply because it's control of the both the data set and as well as the deployment concept. The hard case, I think, is when you get to a scenario where there's stuff that's widely available, and the AI industry has been using it, and we're getting a little bit to data sets here, Jeff. I hope it's all right. But when you have content creators that are out there and they've hosted their stuff under the model of the use cases that were known, let's say a couple years ago, or 5-10 years ago, where you weren't really thinking about training data sets, and scrapings of your materials, and then have that fed into AI models. At least I wasn't, and so the expectations around how those materials would be used would have been potentially, arguably, different than how they're used in some of these training data sets. So you have the content creators that are, call it, fans of a strong reading of copyright, and a light reading of what the U.S. would consider fair use, and then you would have the AI trainers that would be interested in a lighter reading of copyright and a stronger reading of fair use rights for purposes of training. And it's just gonna, at least from where I sit, it feels like it's going to take a few years before that, that sorts itself out. And it's hard to make good recommendations that will stand the test of case law as it evolves, and regulations that might be coming out. I think that's the hard part for me. But I do like the point that there are use cases where you can use public information under permissive licenses and not end up in a place where you worry so much about the copyright issue.
So building on the point we've just made there, it sounds like we could have the principle around open source versus proprietary called out.
Yeah.
But say with proprietary, if a company has signed up to this principle or whatever we're going to call it, they, we trust them that they have met the requirements X, Y, and Z, which would be, the training data set could be confidential, but we have the right to use it, and it's certainly okay to say distribute the product, the AI model, but we're not going to disclose that information to you because it's confidential. But if we sign up to this agreement, we're saying we're comfortable to be audited and say we have done everything above board, rather than sort of protecting things there. So we can be transparent without handing over every piece of information.
Audit is an interesting concept. We haven't talked about that, in at much depth. What do folks think about that? Having third-party audit rights, or customer audit rights, downstream people. How might that fit into a solution here, or not?
This is Tiffany. My question is, would that audit right just to be to confirm that kind of statement that they had the rights to it? Would it be audit rights to actually reproduce the model and do any type of testing? It's really unclear if you say a third-party audit right, what they would be actually auditing. If it's just, prove that you had a license to the data, and then how do you do that when it's your own home? If you just say it's my homegrown data, what would that look like, and what's the effectiveness? I know audit rights, particularly for something in an open source, would just also deter people from adopting that, because it just seems like it would just give an open door, and particularly in situations where it could be a competitor who just comes in and looks through everything. So, I think that would put a chilling effect to a certain degree. But I agree that it is highly relevant to the conversation of proprietary versus open source, where proprietary you'd most likely have more ability to rely on reps and warranties, such as infringement or non-infringement reps, compared to the open source. But my input on this is just it almost feels like it's hard to predict what regulators are also going to expect in this space. There's a lot of proposed legislation about transparency requirements, what that would look like. They don't take an open versus proprietary distinction, right? But they also aren't super prescriptive yet. But that is all expected to evolve and change. And we also have to consider when we're talking about making a statement or a principle about you have the rights to do it, that is also very jurisdiction based. Text and data mining really depends. And even sussing that out would be really difficult. So you'd kind of just be relying on someone's legal interpretation when they make that representation. That might not work if it was you doing it in your jurisdiction.
You make a good point there, Tiffany, and I think we have the power to define what we want OpenChain to state, whether that is just a quick check or a more detailed check.
Yeah, and Tiffany also made a point that this can be connected. Audit rights can be connected to. I counted 3 places. One is, the OpenChain, if we wanted to put it into the spec. Another place would be put it into sort of like a definition, a community definition of what is sort of open source, and there's conversations on that, elsewhere, as to what the nature of that is. And then the third place I think I heard was, you can negotiate those, in proprietary, agreements. So those can be ad hoc, and with those proprietary agreements, there's sometimes broader reps and warranties that you would otherwise get, presumably because you're paying for those rights. I think the chilling effect is something we should take, seriously. My leaning right now is just that maybe we want to stay away from, express audit rights, that as part of any kind of core work we do here. And also audit rights, it's not something that we've really seen in the regulations. We've seen a lot, in China, and in the reading of I have of the EU AI Act, that there would be some type of central government hosted resource, to review models of certain types. But that's not really an audit. That's more like a certification process, for certain types of deployments in given regions. Tiffany, I kind of, did I munge any of your comments? Did you anything to clarify?
No, I think you captured it. I think you picked up on the main point, is that it could have a chilling effect, particularly if it's not well crafted in terms of that expectation. I mean, I've heard commentary that even selecting data sets that might have an audit right attached to it has been a deterrent, right? Like in just research communities, when they release their findings open source, I can imagine there would be the same kinds of hesitations for the rest of the AI system as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the way that open source traditionally kind of leans on this stuff is towards disclosure, and rights for people to be able to make the changes they feel necessary, but not necessarily anything really invasive like an audit, right?
Yeah, although this kind of, I didn't want to bring it up earlier, but David, I think I may have seen you on the GPay open source call earlier this week. The big debate about the terminology, even open source, and what would that mean in the AI context now? And we say open source, but maybe we should just say open, and not offend the purists of that term. Because there are a lot of things that are accessible, but don't necessarily fit the open source definition because of these additional type or invasive or the restrictions. But I think if we've had in other working group meetings or study group meetings that we're seeing that as regulator, that might be a component to comply with regulation or absolve yourself of certain liability from downstream uses that are unintended. So just want to say, when I say open source, I'm meaning just generally and not in the purest sense.
Yeah,
unless that's something that we have to stick to.
No, so I'll just say on the call. There was a call, earlier this week, by this group on GP AI, and there was this very issue that was being discussed by some of the presenters there. My takeaway, though, from all that is that among the purists, there is a growing recognition, even that the AI ecosystem has outpaced them. Their ability to try to create some type of a definition of what open source means to AI is always going to be, at this point, going to be trailing any actual progress the real progress that's happening in the industry. The relevance of a open source definition coming out on this. I think it's not something that I'm personally trying to solve for or anticipate. I think that industry is going to be way ahead of any catch-up effort by the open source community. The open source, I would say OSI community specifically, the purists. I could be wrong, but I'm currently not trying to assume that there is something that they're going to produce is something that we'll have to engineer into the work that we do here. It's just it's orthogonal to what the OSI definition is. That's my personal view, I should say.
Yeah, I'll just note that OSI was on the last panel, and I think they mentioned that they intend to release some sorts of definitions in June. So don't know what it'll be, but it's clear that they're not going to try to stick to the current one. So
yeah, I just
okay. Someone's dropped in a draft what they're working on.
Oh, there it is. Yeah.
Sorry, just to chime in on that very topic, it's something I think we discussed both in setting up this group and in our very first calls on how do we relate to OpenAI or open source AI and those definitions. And I think we agreed that we're not really, that's not what we're here to sort of try to define or relate to. We need to relate to AI, and that in and of itself, it's sort of a hard to define thing almost if you really get into it. And then open source, and I think we have a good understanding of what open source is, and we have perhaps a relatively good understanding of what AI is, and we don't necessarily want to confuse or try to define what open source AI or open AI is. There's other people spending that time and effort, and I'm grateful for them doing that. But we don't need to recreate that effort or that debate in this forum. We need to understand sort of in real life scenarios with the licenses that are out there and the licenses that will be out there that we will be using and consuming large language models and other AI tools under and open source as well. How can we relate to that, and what's good governance and what's good compliance practices relating to that? Just a small clarification.
I think that comment from Jimmy brings us back to the core set of what we need to be talking about, which is like if Jimmy's doing something with a model and he gives it to me, what do I need from Jimmy as to what he did, and then if I'm going to give it to Matthew and Matthew's going to give it to Tiffany, that's a whole chain of things where Tiffany, how does Tiffany get access to the stuff that Jimmy worked on, the metadata, that Jimmy worked on. And, in that chain of custody, I'm thinking mostly about the legal requirements, what must be provided and what should be efficiently provided, and what must be provided in as efficient way as possible.
It sounds like a topic like AI bombs, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
But I don't know if we go into that now or find another time in this call to discuss that. But that might be part of what we're trying to agree here, that we provide an AI bomb. Whatever that AI bomb is, it might be too granular for what OpenChain provides or is used to. You could do an SPDX one, a Cyclone DX one, your own version of one. But if we say you will provide an AI bomb, how you do it is up to you.
Yes. Yeah. To a degree, I would say, right? If we, so back to core principles, if we say there is such a thing as an AI bomb, and that it should be provided efficiently, what are the things? What are the features of those two characteristics, right? What are the features of the AI bomb, and then how do it provide it efficiently? Because if it's too ad hoc, I'm thinking about the Google approach right now. Okay, Google has they've written some materials about this stuff, and it's in my view it's a little soft. The Hugging Face approach, I think, where they have basically a bunch of field and field names actually defined. So, in my view, it's more machine processable. That feels like, something that's more efficient. If somebody wants to sort of talk about the SPDX approach to, model cards, we can, get into that as well. But the notion of, there should be some basic fields identified for that should be going from person to person, and then or entity to entity, and then there should be a way to efficiently deliver that. And my view of efficiency includes machine processability. I should say that I have a bias towards that, and open to talk about that, whether that's a good assumption or not.
I feel as though we've gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole.
We did,
which is fine. Do we want to try and crawl back up and come back to the point on this slide?
Brian, can you save us from ourselves?
I think that the biggest point was whether or not open source and proprietary need to be treated differently, and I think that's still unsettled based on this discussion. I think it's appropriate to acknowledge the chilling effect that this could have on proprietary, but at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that we do want to try to have a common standard, a common approach. And I was just thinking, listen to good conversation here. Maybe it is, maybe there's an out for certain transparency or disclosure requirements that rather than list the particular data set or the particular test, you could just acknowledge conformance. We would have something on the back end to make sure that proprietary models are robust and are going through an OpenChain quality standard of process and handling. So maybe that's the solution, but I don't know.
Could I make a proposal, and feel free to critique that? How about we start by going down the line of we'll treat these two the same, and once we've started capturing things, come back to whether we do need to split it out.
I think that's fair.
Anyone want any views? Feel free to disagree.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dave, I don't know if I have another slide in this deck or not, but there's one other point I was going to make in a related topic.
Yeah, this is your next slide.
Yeah, so this kind of ties to the last slide as well. So I mentioned on the commercial side, the proprietary side, in the matter of just a year, we've seen such drastic changes from various companies on what they release, what they disclose, how open they are. We've seen everything from complete open hand, with the absolute priority being let's have total disclosure, total transparency. Empower the users, empower the regulators, empower everyone to know exactly what's happening. To a shift towards some statements saying we use robust data sets, we test our models, everything is fine here. And so I wanted to call that out as if we don't have a standard for proprietary, I think it's going to continue to wax and wane, and I think that's not good for the industry. I think it would be good to have some consistency there, acknowledging the need for maybe some flexibility for trade secrets or other matters. And then also I want to talk about Hugging Face models. David mentioned that might be something that's machine digestible because they do have fields. However, one of the shortcomings I've been seeing is it's obviously completely voluntary. And so a lot of the models do have fairly robust information on the training data sets or on the known biases or the testing and security measures that were taken. But frankly, a lot of other models sort of pop up. They have an open source license and that's it. And I think we need to continue to flush out some requirements for these models. I think the amount of information and disclosure that's needed for a successful supply chain is going to be greater than the information for just open source software. There's so many facets to this, and I just want to call out these use cases as evidence that we very much greatly need to have this kind of consistent commonality, so people can start making informed decisions on what's in their supply chain. And then lastly, I want to touch on ML Commons as an interesting use case. So for anyone that's not familiar, this is a consortium that, among other things, does AI model safety testing. And we've got some folks at our company that are working with this group, and there's a lot of collaboration happening here. And what they're doing is, as an example, they're taking these large language models, they are throwing prompts at them that would solicit unsavory advice or unsavory answers, and seeing how these models behave. If they come back with a I'm sorry, I can't help you answer, or if they come back with actually an answer that's dangerous, or if they come back with an answer that's wildly off the mark. There's a whole spectrum of ways that these models are behaving under these stress tests. And I think what's interesting about this kind of concept is that if a model goes through something like an ML Common safety test, at the end of the day, it might get us potentially a score or a measurement saying, this model scores a 7 out of 10 on this safety test. That's something that can carry with that model through the supply chain, and people have an understanding of what that means. And while I don't know if there's an opportunity to partner with a consortium like ML Commons, I think just that concept of having data points and metadata that can pass through the supply chain, that everyone has a common understanding of definitionally and substantively what it means, is really critical, so that people aren't having to go and reevaluate and retest at each step. So any thoughts?
Do we apply the same to transparency of data sets? Sorry, my brain is still stuck on that. But a similar process of, I guess auditing is a too strong word, but maybe conformance or standard or something like that to data transparency of training data provenance.
Yeah, so I think Jeff will get into more of the data in a second here, and I do think data is at the forefront of a lot of folks' minds, given the litigation and the copyright concerns. But I think looking ahead, longer term, I do believe that the robustness of a system, its security vulnerabilities, and this isn't the same as like a known security database. These could be architectural security vulnerabilities, or other vulnerabilities, as well as the bias of a model, the performance of a model. I think these are all data points that are going to become increasingly of interest to people in the supply chain, and that we need to lay the groundwork so that people can can convey this information, ingest the information, and further pass it along. So I do think data sets needs a lot of discussion, but I just caution against that eating up all of the attention.
Yeah, agreed.
Thanks for bringing up the ML Commons approach. And if folks haven't looked at that, that is an interesting project there. They took this technology from they took under license some software from Stanford called Helm, HELM, and they're using that as a testing harness for a bunch of prompts. And these prompts some of them are really awful prompts, but they put them in to see whether or not the system knows to recognize that it's asking, the prompt is asking for something, as Brian says, is unsavory. And the the testing framework is all open. So anyone can see those questions. Unlike the approach that the Chinese Cybersecurity Authority has taken, which is you send the model in, and they have a bunch of secret prompts that they won't tell you about, but they test it, and then they'll tell you, I think how your model failed, but you don't get to see the actual prompts because they don't want people to train to those prompts specifically. They want people to train to all the potential varieties of those types of prompts, but not to the prompts themselves. But this kind of approach towards safety testing does seem like something that could be something that would be of interest to people downstream. And this gets into this nexus that I struggle with a little bit. And I've talked about this during some of the workshop, conversations. I believe that there's a way to do some of this work, even when all the regulations are still evolving. If we connect ourselves too deeply to a given requirement around certain types of, call it ethical, responsible, AI disclosures, I worry that we'll be too bound and have to rev our approach, with high frequency, when regulations keep coming out. And I think that as far as whether it's a formal standard or de facto standard, revving a standard very quickly, I think prevents people from putting in the time, investment, and effort to adhere to it, because then that's too much of a moving target. So I do hope that we can do something that's a little bit more simple as a first shot, and then hopefully that will be a little bit less susceptible to new regs and more future proof. That's a little bit abstract, but it's sort of, there's a bit of design philosophy that I was trying to get to on that, trying to keep things more simple. I am, though, bought into this idea that I think a couple of people have said, and I was on the fence on this one, whether or not we should differentiate between proprietary and open source. But let me ask, what do people feel about if we have something that is applicable to both? Should we allow, and let's say it is a standard, should we allow adopters to differentiate and say, I'm adhering to, the OpenChain AI, standard for my open source stuff, but not for my proprietary stuff? I know that doesn't solve for Brian's desire for, a universal key to all this, but I think that there's going to be some hesitation by some companies to be more broad on some of their proprietary stuff. So let's call it just a thought. We don't need to nail that down, but it's at least it's a thought that was sorry.
Dave, we could always see how the next few months evolve when we're starting to capture this. If we see new legislation or see information from OpenChain partners or other partners that they're be more susceptible to do that, I'm keen to build trust in the whole ecosystem, and if it's smaller steps first, then let's try and do it that way, as in with open source and then proprietary, or separate the two out, or how we wish. Yeah,
I'm with you there. My mindset here is that the best creative process for us is going to be, frankly, derivative of what's actually going on in the industry. So understanding what the industry is doing and where those, I've used this term before, common denominators are, and pulling from that and saying this is a core set of approaches that are achievable by companies. In fact, they're actually in some ways doing them. Would be sort of a design approach that at least is in my mind, simply because that seemed to be what worked with OpenChain, in our prior specifications for open source license compliance. Here it's it's different, and we can look at different things as well.
So my few cents on this, for what it's worth, I'm rather for doable than perfect. So I'd rather have something to start with, and then we can continue from there. To some extent, I'm very sympathetic to the vision to treat them all the same, because that gets rid of a lot of sort of issues of, okay, we have a proprietary model with open source elements in it, or it's been trained on open source code or open source data. How do we treat that? Which sort of categories that fall into? Having sort of one overarching view of, we're going to treat sort of, regardless of that underlying model, we're going to treat this the same. I think has benefits in that we avoid a lot of the gray zones, or the hard to delineate things. But if it's more doable to start with sort of one of them, then that's what we should go for. As I said, I rather have a result than striving for a hypothetical perfect result that we may never achieve.
I support that as well.
I also agree with that approach to let's figure out what are the key things that we want to see in, and then, but I also think we should stay open to the fact that once we get much further down the line, we evaluate how this could impact proprietary versus open, and discuss how that could influence adoption, how that might play out in practice, and whether or not tweaking is needed or guidance on how to address the proprietary versus open is recommended to be handled.
Makes
There's
sense.
some further experience from when we did the work in the OpenChain telco group and community. I think we very much started with the idea that we would address sort of one niche use case that was S-bombs in the telco industry, and then sort of it very much sort of grew from there into incorporate also other industries, because what we developed was sort of more broadly applicable. And I have a little bit of a suspicion that that's where we might end up with this. It's not necessarily so that we will end up there, nor something we perhaps should strive for, but I think that we might end up with sort of general principles that are perhaps applicable no matter if it's proprietary or open source. At least a few of the things we come up with will probably be of that nature. But let's start addressing one and sort of see where we end up.
Good. There's a couple iterations of this that I'd like us to think about, though, to just refine our thinking. And we don't have to get all the way into this, but there's different levels of like there's the bare model. As Brian was talking about, it could just be like a bare foundation model, or it could be a simpler version of a AI model. Then there's the people that are providing a more robust AI system. And then there's the, there's going to be like the cloud instances, where it's not just an AI system, but it's also, it's in a cloud instance, and let's say it's public. And then there's call it private deployments, and that could be, private cloud, or, could be, on local devices. And then there's the embedded use cases, right? Where, the user is going to be, not interfacing and putting queries directly into, the input comes in through different channels. It might be through some sensors that are already connected. And then there's also going to be things like safety detect deployments. Okay, like it's for example, you could have an embedded use case where it's like, this is how the car navigates, down the street. and that could have either a higher desire for different types of criteria, or it could have a criteria around let's say reduced transparency, at least transparency as to access to the model itself, because people might want to not allow consumers to be able to access some of those systems. So but there's different permutations of this, in terms of whether or not we're going to go for something sort of like doable but universal. And so I just at least want to put that on the table as something, because going across all these systems, we really then need to keep our asks very simple, at least in its first iteration, so that we have a chance to be able to make sure that this applies across the board. And by the way, I don't think we're talking about doing anything that's normative mandatory. This, just like OpenChain, all of it is to the extent it's normative optional. Okay. Anything else on Brian? Is this your last model slide?
Yes, thanks, Dave.
Okay. All right. So anything on more models before we pivot to data sets? And there's obviously at the end we can come back and talk about everything together. All right. Okay. So with that, let's hand it over to Jeff. Jeff, can you get us moving on data sets, please?
Sounds good. Hey, everybody, as Dave said, I've been embedded in the data aspect of this at Qualcomm. And my approach here when I created these slides was to be high level, and perhaps it's a little bit more nuanced or in the weeds than we've been talking about so far. But I think considering kind of the unique aspects of the data ecosystem, there's value in touching on some of these more specifics as they kind of add context to these themes, such as trust and transparency that we've been talking about. So with data sets, I like to bucket the use of data sets into maybe three primary, or maybe it's a little bit more than three, but these core use cases here. So when we talk about using third-party data sets, are we ingesting this data set for internal research? And that's where it's starting and stopping. Does that research involve the testing, training, benchmarking of models? This research, is it going to segue to product development, which then could be distributed to the product itself? And is the data set itself going to be potentially distributed, redistributed by the company, modified or otherwise? Similarly, is the creation of data sets, what are the use cases for that? Is that relegated to internal use, or are you intending to distribute that data set? When thinking about use of a data set, I kind of created a list here of differing levels of specificity of things that, and this is not all inclusive, but some topics I think that are rise to the level of more important is the density of the analysis of data sets, and perhaps why certain levels of transparency can be important. So the first thing obviously we'll talk about is usually licensing. And is this the license itself, is it for the data set? Does it include the data, or is it kind of this mirror wrapper of the data, this aggregation of the data, maybe perhaps the structure, sequence, organization of the data? Some of these kind of newer licenses, these quasi open source licenses, they specify whether it's just the data set itself, or it includes both data and the data set. Similarly, got kind of terms of use that could be separate from the license for it. So especially coming from the research aspect of where a lot of this arose from, there may not be a license attached to it, and maybe just a hyperlink to an organization's terms of use that may talk about how its posted material could be used. These terms of use could apply in conjunction with it. So all of these play a role in acquiring a data set. And also, I think, an added complexity, partially because perhaps not everybody has a dense understanding of, traditionally in the data aspect of open source licenses, you'll often see a license and it's unclear if it just relates to the code associated with creating that data or companion code to be used along with it. And sometimes the teams don't know themselves and they're just relying on almost like a academic style citation, and then it's almost like an implied license scenario. One of the biggest kind of rabbit holes of data set analysis is what I call kind of cascading data sets, where you look at a data set and you're starting to kind of do this due diligence on it, and it's got a license, and you dig a little bit, and then you realize that the data set is based on another data set, or it's not based on a specific data set, but they pulled data from another thing, and all of a sudden you're 2, 3, 4 tiers down trying to figure out the origins of that data. Similarly, you have, I think, at different points of data set creation, and this goes to kind of data provenances, data set may be different types of data may be added at different points, such as annotations may be provided by the data set. In the last stage, how are there rights associated with that? Was it crowdsourced? So I think overall, from a high level, got a lot of unknowns regarding licensing and rights. My next point regarding data provenance is kind of something that I've seen a lot, where perhaps, and this is an arbitrary kind of reference, maybe Google posts a data set, and then somebody else takes that data set with or without modification and puts it on Hugging Face. And there's a lot of there's a lack of clarity regarding what's in that data set, what the rights are. Perhaps even a bit more nefarious is if something was introduced into that just to create a security vulnerability, but that information isn't there.
Hey Jeff,
Yep.
can I pause you for just a second to address? I saw Alice's question about us taking a break.
Yeah.
I wish I saw it sooner. It would have been a good spot to take a break before data sets. Sorry, Alice. Would it be okay for us to finish this slide and take a break, Jeff? Is that all right?
Yeah, or right now.
Yeah.
I think yeah, this is a good spot.
This is a good spot. Okay. All right. Yep. Why don't we do that? If folks are okay with that, can we do just like a, okay.
Like just go to the bottom of the hour, Dave.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, want to do bottom of the hour? Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Okay, so we are at 7:30. We can probably get going again.
Great. So we left off, we were talking about licensing, data provenance, and actually I forgot to mention another kind of in the weeds nuances. Often in data set creation, data creation, there's use of tool chains, tool chains that are often under open source licenses, and that has to be something that has to be considered when you're kind of going through this process of determining what aspects of licensing and rights are associated with this data. I've seen data tool chains that license under the GPL, and so that analysis has to include that. So in addition to kind of these licensing thing, we have these buckets, and we don't need to deep dive on each of these, but you've got copyright, obviously, privacy, which I think is very important, because that's something that's often something we're having to follow up on. Privacy is not usually discussed much in the data set cards I'm seeing, so it's unclear if consent was given a lot, and that's something that needs to be determined. And even when a license appears to account for something like privacy, like version 4 of Creative Commons, I believe Creative Commons states that privacy is one of the rights given in that license, but did the person applying that license know that? So privacy is something that in the bucket of transparency should be something that is considered. Export concerns, this obviously is geo-based, for example, something like China, and you're talking about the types of data, and does it relate to national security? Does it relate to high information regarding large numbers of people, populace? And then, of course, data like models. You've got bias, accuracy, safety, responsible use. The interesting thing with data sets, of course, is it often turns on how you're using the data that determines if something is accurate or if it's biased. But often the way it was collected, there's concerns that arise in those areas too, and something that should be noted and potentially carried over. Go to the next slide, Dave. So in the review process, obviously accounting for these things I was talking about in a appropriate legal review. When you start thinking about kind of requirements that are filtering down via laws and regulations, one of them is storage solutions. And this is perhaps a little bit nuanced for here, but there's requirements around keeping data, and this is largely privacy based, but for the only time that's needed, the ability to audit and delete, the ability to control geographically, where's the data set going to be stored, what country, where can it be shared, how do you want to control storage and access within your company and also outside of the company, security requirements surrounding that. These two kind of broader issues that we've been talking about, trust in the information you're getting, so your due diligence is accurate, and that's one of the number one things. And I know we've been addressing that in the questions that have been posed about data, is when you want to ingest something, can you trust the information that allows you to do an appropriate analysis of whether that data set can be used, and providing that information to others. Accountability, when I wrote this, I was thinking, and it's tied to that next point there, it's also accountability within the company to adhere to these use cases by different stakeholders. Move on to the next, Dave. So we've talked a lot about open versus proprietary. I often, went in a review aspect of this, I'm thinking about it just largely in terms of scope of use restrictions, and needing to know that information to determine if use is even feasible for the requested use case. I know in the comments, notice requirements, these are taking the form both in attribution of potentially license, some of the data, even these kind of research style citations that most include making sure these are carried over so that whomever uses these data sets in whatever use case is aware of these things. And then we kind of enter this domain of these open source style licenses. And I showed an example at the bottom, the CDLA sharing v1, which has kind of viral requirements in that data set. And, well, first off, it covers both data set and data, but the data and then quote unquote enhanced data being under the same license. So making sure people are aware of that and ability to track it. Other licenses have, I've seen have similar kind of source style requirements, though, that basically they don't call it derivatives, but derivatives of or output of, if a model is created, results in certain source style requirements that filter down through the distribution chain. So these need to be appropriately identified. And going back to the whole rabbit hole thing, like if a tool chain was used under a copyleft license that encumbers output for some reason, and that wasn't acknowledged when you received that information, or one component or a data set was used with a copyleft style license, we need to know that information to see if that affects or carries over to the larger data set for whatever reason. I think I have one more slide, perhaps.
On this, can you remind me, Jeff? So when you say data set and data set versus data, you mentioned this before, but so data set, is that like structure, sequence, organization?
I think that's the way to think about it, like a box.
Okay.
And it's that, so when somebody says data set license on its face, I think that's the next question, because the way that people are using that right now, the person may not know the difference. So you need to determine if it includes it. And the obvious use case of that is the data set provider is the person that collected the data. Perhaps they filmed the videos or shot the videos and received the consent for that. And they may say the data set license is under a CC license or Apache 2. And in that sense, the information would point towards it's both the data set license and the data license.
Got it. Thank you. The next slide.
Yes, please. And just an example, and there's certainly more complicated examples, but here we've got this conceptual captions 3 million data set. And it was scraped, and this is, I believe, a Google data set. It was scraped by just going through millions of websites. Actually, the original, and I believe, and I'm not quite sure about this, where it's hosted now, but the original way to acquire the data set, I think, was through a script. So the actual data itself wasn't provided. The user would have to run a script to go grab all the data itself. So here's an example of data set versus data. And the license itself, I believe, was just this language here. So highlighting a lot of kind of these legal threads, copyright, licensing, rights, privacy, etc.
Hey, Jeff, have you seen a lot of reverse indemnity, in these data set licenses? Where it's, in order to use someone's data set, you have to indemnify them for any liability as a result of your use of the stuff that they, organized or provided a script to pull down.
Definitely, I see a lot of that in kind of these research style licenses. It's something that definitely has to be looked out for, and it's quite common.
I see a question from, okay. Yeah, Jimmy replied to Victor's question. Thanks. Yeah, it's being recorded. It's probably going to be put on YouTube, Victor. That Shane tends to like to put his recordings on YouTube, which is great for accessibility. All right, so thank you, Jeff, for that discussion. Anyone comments, questions, observations?
I have a question to Jeff, because you have probably taught a lot more about this than me. So I'll take the opportunity to get the benefit of your wisdom. Have you seen any open source license or thought of any of the more classical open source licenses that would be problematic if there was data put under that was made part of a data set, or if that was sort of the single data set for that matter, not just part of the data set, but if the entire data set was made available under those? And is that something you think we should watch out for, or there's no use case where we think that it's problematic?
I think it really turns on use case, like how it. So a hypothetical perhaps is, and I've seen GPLv3 data sets, is how is it going to be used? Like, so let's say an entity wants to bring that in and perhaps supplement that data set with their own data and then distribute that data set for some reason, then I think the analysis perhaps would have to include how does the data set and or data license under the GPLv3 affect the entity's new additions, and is that a concern? Or is it strictly for internal use? And perhaps then you're going to question a distribution kind of chain of analysis there. So I think that certainly in that rabbit hole cascading data set analysis, something like that is vital. Courts will tell us, and Dave was talking about eventually data and the relationship to models and copyleft licenses, and people have opinions on that, but that certainly is another aspect of this.
I have a feeling, I don't know for sure, but I have a feeling that relative to and we've talked about this, and I didn't catch the name of the person speaking, in Cambridge about this, but I appreciate the point about transparency data sets. But I think where we might end up landing, at least in the interim, as an industry, not necessarily speaking for OpenChain, as an industry, is transparency as a training data sets is gonna kind of be like an optional thing. Not that I don't want to opine whether that's the right or wrong answer. I just think that the legal departments in any given company are going to be reluctant at this juncture to be over disclosing on training data sets simply because of the liability issues right now that are just uncertain. I'm not convinced as a private citizen that that's the right answer long term, but I think that's the answer for now until we have clarity.
Someone in the comments brought up the kind of the valuable point of the commercial non-commercial analysis, and that's interesting. Regarding CC, they actually have some valuable guidance in their FAQs, but especially since this is coming from research ecosystems largely, data in general, there's lots of language about non-commercial and varying degrees of defining what non-commercial is. Like I've definitely seen licenses that non-commercial can include a commercial use by a commercial entity, but then carve out certain types of uses, and that's a use case analysis also.
Thanks. Hey, I'd like to take us back to your first page. How do I back up? Okay, on this, because I think your first slide actually had a lot of, the summary of the issue spotting pieces. Okay, I think there's fertile ground for conversation on this, simply because this covers so many different disciplines across the board. And when we talk about things like, like privacy, every region has its own framing of privacy issues, and a lot of them have commonality, and yet there's a lot of differences as well. And not speaking as a privacy expert, but having spoken with other folks that make a living out of this practice. And then the exfiltration, or I would call it exporting, of data outside of certain countries and regions that are sensitive to, their citizens' data being transmitted to parties overseas. That's just inherent in everything. And then there's there's different levels of hygiene that you have relative to the consents that you have, relative to like the images of people. And questions whether or not just having a cam set up in public spaces, in public, let's say a public park, is sufficiently adherent to the local legal framework. All these things I think are interesting questions that boil down to like use in data sets. And when you do have issues, how much of those issues need to be transmitted and disclosed, into folks that either are downstream on the data set, or folks that are using those data sets to create models. And I think we should probably parse them into two different pieces. Data sets are, it's in front of us because of its synergistic or complementary nature relative to models. But it's as Jeff has talked about, it's its own ecosystem as well. You can have a business providing data sets and cleaning up data sets, providing annotations, and adding modularity for, let's say, this is the data set for further training once you have trained on this initial data set, and you can iterate on those things. But it's its own ecosystem as well, independent of whether or not you actually use that for training yourself or other people do it. So it's a question to me, how deep we want to go into this, and whether or not this is in fact the right set of metadata that we should be looking at. Because there is a way for us to say we're not going to, data sets, it's going to be its own thing. And then there's going to be a input potentially from data sets to some models. But models can be their own thing as well. Or whether or not we want to marry, our data set thinking, with model thinking into one bundle. Whether that is, that would make sense, because the regulatory regime for data sets has aspects to it, as per this list, that are incremental to models.
So I think at the moment they appear to be very much linked, especially with large language models where they're using a lot of data. But it would be worth considering whether that's, I guess, a requirement in AI. Or what if future ways of future ways of in which the technology will evolve will also imply this really strict relationship between data sets and models.
Mm-hmm.
Is there use in coupling them together? What does that bring us versus having them separate, which might gain more flexibility in the future?
Yeah, it might be worthwhile for us to sort of have a particular initial use in mind. as we iterate on a sort of an really, simplified version. I do like your idea of thinking about large language models, because then that highlights a few things. The privacy concerns, might get diminished because, we're not actually looking at typically like images of people if it's text to text, for example, in an LLM. But if it's going to have some visual aspect to it, then obviously we have to start thinking more about privacy. And then but then you do have all the common issues around bias, accuracy, safety, the ethical aspects of this stuff that come into play. But I wanted to put that on the table, but I'm open to us, just having them, linked together in the way that you suggest. Okay, all right, cool. Anything else on data sets for discussion?
Nothing for me.
There's a question in the chat, Dave.
Yeah, just saw that. So yeah, Augustin said, do you know about the data set, the stack from BigCode that uses SWH, software hardware? SWH, archive of open source software heritage, thank you. Archive of open source code as data source. They ended up building their data set based on strong copyleft code, only plus 6 terabytes. Some of the points made by Jeff were taken in consideration there for research purposes. I do not know the details though. Jeff, do you happen to have any observations on this one?
And so I believe, and I don't recall exactly, I believe there was a version 2 of the stack where they filtered out a lot of these copyleft style licenses. That's what I remember about that. So that solves a little bit for that. But then, of course, you got remaining, I think, topics of conversation. Like I believe these were GitHub, so you're scraping from GitHub and associated attribution for that. A lot of these kind of themes you're seeing in litigation that should be addressed in the analysis, that is.
All right, cool. I just want to talk about something just quickly as a point of order. In the beginning, I mentioned that we would take notes and provide a summary of the conversation without including the names of the people providing comments. But I recognize that this is being recorded. It might get posted onto YouTube, which if you're not wanting to have your identity disclosed, then that's let me get input on that. In which case, I'll send a note to Shane that we actually shouldn't follow that protocol. So just if anyone wants to either send a note right now or comment about that, or send me a note privately, I will cause the YouTube link to not get posted in consultation with Shane. Okay, all right, thanks. That doesn't mean that the window for comment on that is closed. I just meant I finished talking about that point. All right, so if there's nothing else on data sets, let's go to
for me, Dave, it would be good, maybe now or later. I saw on the slide that you just had up and the one earlier on models, some good headers that we might want to, so this slide here, and then there's another one about models, to get some form of agreement and consensus. Are these the areas that we want to focus on? Are there any others in there? You talked earlier about privacy, export control concerns. This could be something we could document by saying you have done the relevant due diligence for your use case around export control. without maybe going into too many more details. So I'd be keen to understand what we think the other issues might be, issue spotting here, for classifications of what we can maybe document, and then what level of detail we might believe that we should go into granularity for some good principles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's capture that. Do you recall what slide that was? So there's this piece here, and then I go back to the model.
You go back, I will. This one here.
Okay.
This one here, yeah.
Okay, slide 4 on the deck, and I'll look for a way to share the deck for anyone who wants to get access to it. This is all going to be OpenChain materials under CC, 0 universal. Yes.
So as I look at this slide, I think to myself, if I'm either a user of a model or a creator of a model, whether it's open source or proprietary, we can discuss later. But for me, I would like some level of transparency, some due diligence on bias. I would like to know a bit about testing and so on as we go down that list. Are there other things that people in this community would like to know about? And then, what level of detail? As I sort of mentioned a few times with transparency, I'm all for being very transparent as best as we can. But there are some companies here that will have proprietary components that we can't necessarily be as transparent about, but we could define some principles to say, well, I have done a copyright review of the training data. I'm not going to share it with you, but I agree that I had the rights to use that, and so on. So those are the sort of things that I'm looking for next. So maybe in the first instance, this list here on models, and then the other one on data sets. Anything else that people would be interested to hear about if you are either a user or a creator of a model?
Well, I guess it is included in data sets, but database rights.
Database rights,
Can
okay.
we include that within data sets?
Might come under testing, all that reliability.
Reliability is being mentioned.
Okay, let me actually shift this, okay, to a notes page. So let's see. If I were to put in a new share and share
Something that just came to my mind, but I don't know if it's very relevant, is the interdependence within the industry. Like, will the user be interested in knowing where has the model been originated? Like, what's the composition of the model? I'm saying this because we need to think not only in the legislative aspect, but also in the ethical aspects. Like, ethics can deeply vary in a country by country basis. And for example, in the field of autonomous cars, I can think of this study that was very famous back in the day, where people were asked in a country by country basis if the algorithm had to make a decision on what life to prioritize within the car, what would that be? And people from different countries were giving very different responses.
So I just summarize, I don't know whether people heard that here. We were talking about maybe stating the dependencies of the model and the countries of where the model was either created or the training set has come from, so we can capture some jurisdictional information. My thoughts on that is I don't know whether that's too granular for It's almost solving the how part of this question. So if we agree that we should have some information on interdependency, or sorry, dependency on where it has come from, I guess it would be down to the individual signing up to that, how they would implement it. And that might be using an AI bomb, which includes the information from the product origin, as it were.
So I'd like to raise one point in relation to sort of product origin, or the origin. Where was this model trained? Sort of, if we can have a country of origin for it, and perhaps this is way too detailed and a very niche use case. But I just went over our company's corporate social responsibility and sustainability report, and sort of looking at what's our carbon footprint. And then it sort of occurred to me that maybe it's interesting to look at the carbon footprint of an AI model to see sort of where was this trained. Was it trained sort of in a data center in Norway that has primarily hydroelectric, which is a very sort of green, quote unquote, electricity source, or was this trained in Saudi Arabia that gets most of its energy from carbon fuels?
Just following up on, sorry.
Oh, thanks. Excuse me. I haven't spoken so long. My voice is going quickly. I'd love to. It would be helpful to me, and I don't know if it'd be helpful to everyone else to sort of have this framed by some questions a little bit. Like, what do we actually need to know about models when we use them, and that will help us to understand what information that we would be looking for to answer those questions. So, I mean, I guess the questions would be like, what can I use this model for? Which is where we get with usage restrictions. Like, how was this model trained? Which might be to do with, data sets and some other things. Who made this model? What legal framework, what jurisdiction was it created under? Like, maybe those kinds of, for me, I would find those kinds of questions a little bit more helpful to then help us drive what information we need.
Yeah, this gets into.
Otherwise, I'm not sure not sure if we know what we're solving for. Maybe it's obvious to others, but it's not so to me.
No, these are good points. This is more. I was just transposing the issues list, but getting to these questions is the core of it. There's a couple. So there's something else that we didn't mention. There's something called a system card, and the system card is more about how to get, like, let's say, the API access to this thing. What are the technical hooks to interact with this model? If you were to embed it, how would you potentially embed it? And so there's sort of a more like an engineer's view of that of the problem, so to speak, of how to work with it, and then you can look at the Google materials, which kind of talks about, like, it's like the user manual, the user guide to it. Here's how, here's some background on it, but it's not in the way that they seem to be going about it. Doesn't look like it's the machine processable way that I was kind of talking about earlier. Although it's helpful. It doesn't get down to those efficiency aspects that I was trying to urge us consider. I want to put something out, that isn't completely responsive to your question, Alice, but maybe I can come back to it, because these aspects down here around accountability and transparency and bias, these aspects have most jurisdictions I've been thinking about anyway are rooted in regulations, and there are, like, business constraints and consumer constraints around what people want to have as well. But regulations are rooted in this stuff, or these are rooted in regulations, and I'm hoping that we can come up with a framework that is reflective of just the pragmatics in this area and can withstand, all the vicissitudes of changing regs. So I would ask, what do folks think about us going with a framework that's just about a few things? Okay, it's about, yes, there's going to be some type of AI bomb, bill of materials. We should provide it efficiently, and then and we start with just bare bones stuff around what are the compliance requirements that need to be communicated to people downstream, because they need to be bound by those obligations, because of if the person upstream is constrained on their uses, then the person downstream logically has no more no broader use than the person upstream. So those compliance artifacts, such as licenses, need to be conveyed downstream. And and I do hear the request to have the output of this thing be applicable to both proprietary and open source, at least for purposes of trying to make this sort of more universal. But if we start with those aspects of it, none of what I just said covers the things that are like in regulations. None of that is in the bias or the accountability or the transparency aspects. Those are all desirables. Those are all things that might be required by different countries, depending on the origin conversation, where it was created, where it's expected to be regulated and such. There might be things that are sort of like nice to haves as well. Like, I'd like to know, if I run this thing, what's the energy footprint when I'm running it? When it was created, maybe I don't want to use a model that was created using high amounts of, petroleum. So, petroleum-based energy. But, those are things I think, the nice to haves versus the essentials for compliance. I see a potential opportunity for differentiating, but I don't want to I don't want to suggest something that doesn't have legs with this, with the group here that's wanting to work on this project.
Thanks, David. I've got some thoughts. So for this, I agree that having compliance artifacts for what is kind of minimum, the minimum standard, what's needed, is important, particularly from a license perspective. I do think that a lot of the topics or items that you named as nice to haves or optionals might not be in regulation today. And that could very easily change as additional guidance comes out, particularly from the EU/AI Act, for example, on those. And I'll note a point I was going to make earlier, even just about environmental concerns. Like, environmental impact was mentioned in the EU/AI Act, and how that flows down, no one knows. That said, I think in any kind of like AI bomb, I think, that would need to be something that could be left blank if people just don't know, and decisions by downstream users of like, based off what regulations they're subject to, can take it or not take it, because if they don't, they don't have enough information to comply. But I also, and similarly, you're seeing this from, I think, in the CIO in the UK about bias aspects. Transparency, I think, is coming across in regulations across the board. So while they're not there today, I would like, my goal would be my participation in this group to also help future-proof and understand what is coming down the pike, and perhaps how that could shape out. And I don't know, I haven't been in other OpenChain projects. Is it something where there are like mandatory, disclosures, and then additional optional disclosures that can be included for these, desirables, or in my mind, soon to be eventually regulated types of elements that a downstream user would need to know to meet, their regulatory obligations, or even their internal CSR commitments.
Yeah. I think that hits it like right on the spot, Tiffany. So the counterpoint, let me reflect on that, and open it up for additional discussion. And let me also bring it back to Alice's comment as well. So the counterpoint to what I said about keeping it utterly simple and just the compliance artifacts is, to Tiffany's point, in order to comply with the regulations in any given place that you're going to deploy, you have to have some information from upstream. And so if it's just purely like license information, then you don't have enough in order to adhere to the rules and regulations that will be coming out, and in some places are out, around transparency and bias and other things. So what then is that minimum set that needs to go through the supply chain to people that need to comply in any given place, any given jurisdiction around the world? And so that goes to, I think, also, what Alice was commenting about, like, I need to know, how was this trained? Who made it? And where did it come from? So those kinds of origin questions are some of those, can't be ignored if we're going to have a useful bill of materials that transmits with the model itself. And I don't have an answer to that beyond that. That's a really tough question. It's
yeah. There's just one more point that I wanted to note as well, that I view as, one of these kind of necessary aspects that you could shoehorn into, not necessarily a licensing, but a product liability perspective. But, the question about, does your car kill this, old lady or kill the young child, while that sounds like just kind of a research question, it actually, I think, does implicate the conversations about use restrictions. So, for example, in the UAI Act, or to absolve yourself of certain type of liability, you might actually need to name the certain types of intended uses. Like, this is the intended use, this is what it was designed for, and in there list out the limitations under that intended use. This is very similar to pharmaceuticals and other type of strict liability products. So I don't want to add more things to the list, but I do feel that is something as well, as if this particular model is being held out for an intended use, that limitations, and as you said, user manual, those might actually also be something that are more in the required bucket than as a desirable bucket, which I know is a little, that is the big deviation from what we're used to in open source, but from my view, that is where the regulation is going. And for compliance, as a lawyer, what I would want to know, and if I was advising someone whether or not they can or should use a particular model coming from a third-party provider.
Yeah, I hear you on that. By the way, the reason I keep standing up and sitting down is because I just moved into this office. There's a motion sensor on the other side that can't see me, and so anyway. I go ahead, Jimmy.
No, sorry. I were just clearing my throat. I didn't realize I had the mic on. But since you gave me the word, I think that a lot of the things Tiffany said were really great. But one thing caught my attention, that's the use case here. That would require us to actually have a common understanding of the various use cases that are applicable, so that we could declare against a particular use case and say, these are the use cases we have cleared this for, that in our understanding as releasing this, these are the use cases we can sort of feel reasonably comfortable this is okay to use for. But currently we don't have a common model to understand which are the use cases we are talking about. At the high level, I think we do, but just talking internally within our own company, I think we have sort of so many different variations of various use cases that it very quickly becomes very, very complicated. So perhaps that's not an item for us to work on, but a problem for us to think on, at least, to understand what are the various use cases, so that we can actually sort of declare that this contains sufficient information for these and these use cases. We have artifacts that are sufficient for these and these use cases.
Do you think that would be something that needs to be there needs to be a set list versus, you know, the intended use by the provider? Because I agree, you can't scope out. I mean, this is the challenge with AI. You can't scope out the potential use cases that can be incredibly broad or very nuanced. And I think the way I'm reading the tea leaves and regulation is it's what you say, you put it out and just declare what it's used for, and then you also then are responsible for disclaiming or providing the different types of limitations in that particular use case that you're trying to address. But um, are you saying that it should be a kind of set list?
I don't know if a set list is possible. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't, and perhaps a set list would still have to sort of contain some modularity to sort of say that, well, it's all these use cases except in this and this scenario. But I don't think, I haven't seen an effort to sort of harmonize that description of what the use cases are. I think we probably all in our organization have a list of various use cases and various scenarios and various modifications to those scenarios and use cases that would sort of make something allowable or not allowable. But I don't think we have sort of a common list or a common language to talk about it. Perhaps that's not possible. Perhaps it's also context dependent and detail dependent that we can't do it. So for me, I feel that having that common list, at least at the high level, and then being able to, well, the high level we have cleared here, but we have these carve outs from it. I don't know if it's a useful exercise, but if we want to have sort of what is the bare minimum compliance artifacts that we need to convey downstream, well, either you take a minimalist approach to that or you take a maximalist approach. What's sort of the maximalist we could ever need, or what's the minimum that we could ever need? Or you take the approach that, well, in this case, when we only have this information, only these use cases can come in question, or you only have sufficient information for these use cases. If you want to use it for something else, obviously, that's going to be on you, where you need to do the due diligence yourself to fill out the blanks. I don't know if that makes sense, but having sort of the combination of an understanding for the use cases, at least on a high level use case, and what are the minimum compliance artifacts we would need for that. I think that may be valuable, or it may not be. I don't know if it's even possible. As was written in the chat, we tried and quickly got stuck, because that's a particular deep rabbit hole to go down.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, saying compliance and then also talking about compliance within a particular user sector can be misleading. I think Dave's point was compliance artifacts just generally across the board from like a model or AI system perspective that isn't sector specific. And so my comment wasn't to say, like we have to then understand the regulations and let's say, people detection for self-driving cars in different across, global jurisdictions, but more or less like that kind of open field of from a transparency perspective, but not necessarily saying that it would be then compliant for that particular use case.
Yeah, I think we're resonating, together on where we need to go. Let's acknowledge Rowan's comments here in chat. He mentioned the open real license in particular. When we're talking about the like use cases, and sorry, it was more like intended uses and limitations. There is an attachment to that license that actually has a whole bunch of them. I personally find that list very well intended, but there's some provisions there that I think are difficult to know for sure that is 100% met. And then also he mentioned master list of use cases disallowed in observed licenses plus master list of regulatory requirements observed globally. I don't quite understand that one, Rowan. I don't know if you want to.
Sorry, yeah. What I mean is, I mean, I agree with you completely that the attachment A in Open Rail is impossible to demonstrate that you're in compliance with, but there will be things, there'll be requirements that will be passed on when you receive a model from somebody else, because so many people are using those licenses. So in order to at least pay lip service to doing something about them, one needs to know at least that those are use cases that have been ruled out. And then also, I guess, you know, being in the UK, the Information Commissioner's Office at the moment is doing a consultation on what, as somebody who makes available, say, an open model, what responsibilities you need to take for downstream uses. And although it is only a consultation at this stage, the kind of reliance that they're expecting people to be able to put on the originators of models basically makes open distribution of models, or indeed, you know, I come from university, research output distribution of models impossible. So that's worrying me slightly. But still, the fact that, you know, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK requires a mad set of things that no one can meet is something that should be recorded if what we want to do here is come up with a kit for compliance which applies globally. You say, well, actually, you know, if what you're doing has been touched or is relevant to the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, then you're in big trouble. So maybe don't do your work there and don't use models generated there. Although, and I say that as somebody who works for a UK university who does not want that to be the outcome.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's the rub, right? You know, it's how much, if you're a policy maker in a given country or region, you know, how much you come down on, you know, compliance requirements when it's going to require a lot of adjustment by the people actually developing these models, and potentially, at least, you know, they would argue, you know, are perceived to slow them down.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question about a couple of areas that whether we would want to consider them. So I'm not saying we should, I'm just asking. So one of them is about access to information about how the model actually works. So the actual technical details, access to understand those papers, which can be sometimes quite vague. And the other aspect of this is ability for the model to explain itself, which is something that has been a bit of a cop-out in machine learning and historically, where machine learning scientists say that there's no way to understand, and I think maybe we should try maybe we should try a bit more, especially now with more verbose output of these models. So that's one thing, and the other thing is about access to training compute resources. If only such a reduced number of entities has access to train these models, that sounds like it's slightly counterproductive or detrimental to open source, where they're putting out these, you know, the technical, you know, how these models work and look how efficient, how useful they are, but only we can train them. I have no idea what a solution could be to that, but it might be something to consider.
Yeah, that feels like, you know, it's one of those almost like, you know, the multi-jurisdictional trade policy issues that are coming into play on, you know, access to, you know, the higher end compute resources on that one. It's a good point. I was trying to get to on the first one, the technical details on how the models work. I was trying to you know, talk about that as its own thing. You know, there's, if you read what Hugging Face did a study on model cards, and you know, it's worth looking at their study on it. It was basically like, you know, what are people actually doing? Because, you know, the space is so fragmented. And their observation, at least, you know, one of them that I took away was, depending on the discipline of the author of the model card is going to look very different. If it's an engineer writing the model card based on sort of how he or she developed that model or that team, then it's going to be about, you know, so that those technical features to, you know, you're talking about the details of how they actually work, and at least that engineering team's experience in developing that. And then if you have, you know, sort of the the lawyer drafting it, then it's going to have more focus on the licenses. And then if you have the call it the sociologist, working on it, and I know that's not a real profession. Sorry, it's a profession, but it's not a real job title in the company. But the one that is sort of more responsible for the ethical aspects of things, to the extent that that person is involved in the process, they're going to talk about the responsible AI principles, connected to this stuff. And so it's a very multidisciplinary thing in order to come up with a cogent model card that addresses all these things. And so that's why I was observing that this system card thing is something that engineers might be like more attracted to, that are less connected to some of these other pieces around call it compliance. It's more about the functional operation of it. I have a question for you about your other point about the ability of the model to explain itself. Were you talking about explainability about output, or the decision-making process, in order to come up with a recommendation, or the probabilistic process, I would say, and then, or is it so? Is it more about like disclosure of like weights and and hierarchy?
No, it's more about the development process of the model. Why were certain, I guess, yeah, it is to do with weights. So why were certain parameters chosen by the training process? Why it works the way it works, which is something that machine learning scientists have not been able to answer sometimes. And perhaps it's worth trying a bit harder to move in the direction of AI being able to explain itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It comes back to transparency, really, doesn't
Sure,
it?
yeah.
And
also to control for the human side of the equation, where we might reach a point where we don't no longer have control over why this model looks the way it does. I think that, I don't want to put conspiracy theories out there, but I think that might be soon. And I think going the direction of kind of calling this out as a problem a bit more might be useful.
So it's important that the AI can explain to a human, and a human can understand what the AI is doing, rather than just an AI trying to convince an AI what it's doing.
Yeah.
And we're seeing some of those AI convincing AI things out there right now, around, in particular around accuracy efforts, where you have a model that's, their only job in life is to be an accuracy tester. And so, the LLM's doing its thing where the foundation models, chugging away at inferencing. And then right before it's displayed, as to the output, the accuracy, machine, just, says, is this good to go? And accuracy, and explainability and interpretability, these are all things that are actually in the at least on the U.S. framework, the NIST risk management framework. It's in other frameworks as well, including the EU AI Act. So so then the question becomes, coming back to Tiffany's observation, in order to provide information downstream to people to be able to say, yes, I'm deploying this thing, it's based on this thing that was developed upstream, it's meeting the accuracy requirements, it's meeting the explainability requirements, and they would be housed in different parts of the model card, maybe the more technical aspect versus the social, responsible, ethical aspect, and then there's the legal aspect. I don't know that this is going to be a very easy problem for OpenChain to be able to solve, honestly, because it's such a hard ask to be able to provide the right amount of information, right? It's like, do we over function on the idea of providing all those technical details, and basically oversupply the details as a requirement, under a certain specification, and future proof this for where we think the regulations are going to go, or do we scale back and try for a more minimum use case?
For what it's worth, Dave, I like the idea of the minimum use case. I think Jimmy and others have touched on it before, and then building on it as we progress and develop a second version. We look at the maturity model of the license compliance that has evolved over the years, and I can see us doing this here. For example, we touched on the use cases and listing all the use cases out. I think it would be wonderful if we could do that, but I don't think it's achievable right at the start. So do we simply say in the first version that, you should define your own, what this model actually does, and not have to worry about the detail, and we can flesh that out later if people are wanting to categorize certain classes of product. So I don't know what others people think of, but I'm all for a minimal viable bit of information that we can all standardize and agree on, and then progress as we get more mature.
Yeah, in order to make this more concrete, I wonder if it's worthwhile for us to start with the Hugging Face model card is something that I think might be of interest for a potential starting point, because it's got a lot of pre-thinking done in it, and Hugging Face, obviously they're very informed by what people are doing in the actual industry and the practices. But I might ask if people think that that's a good starting point, or maybe there's another starting point for getting down to kind of like the brass tacks of what needs to be provided, because Hugging Face does start getting into things like what are the intended uses, what are the out of scope uses, biases, risks, and limitations are its own section, and then the user information, like the user working manual, like how to get started with model, that's got its own section. And then, around training details, there's a section for like the training data. And I think I've already talked about my worry there, but I think that's something that we have to, include as a potential piece that, people might want to have. Training procedures, evaluation, processes, what are the metrics? They even have to Jimmy's, point, the environmental impact. Anyway, so there's a whole bunch of stuff that's already in that card that we should probably think about and see if that is a good starting point. Jimmy?
So perhaps we don't have to define, and this goes a little to what you and Matthew said, perhaps we don't have to define every use case. Perhaps we can define a few fairly common use cases that are sort of constrained and easily understood. And we can define these are the compliance artifacts that we would need from someone supplying this to us to feel comfortable or somewhat better equipped, at least, to deploy this within the sort of myriad of sub use cases that could exist within this sort of overarching use case. So perhaps a bad example, but if the use case is we're only going to use this internally for our product development, okay, that gives us a certain set of compliance artifacts I would want to have. And if we can agree for that sort of simple use case, absolutely, this is sort of what we can agree that at a minimum you need, right? Then your own company policy might very well call for even more information to be comfortable with doing that. But at least we have sort of a baseline of what we would need. And if we can do a few of these fairly abstract use cases, or let's not say abstract, but not very detailed use cases, then we have a starting point. Because I think we all know that we can endlessly dig into the exceptions and the various subclasses of these use cases that could exist, but we tweak one variable and everything changes. But if we focus on those sort of overarching use cases, if we could define 2 or 3 of them, and say, well, this is what we think should be supplied for creating trust. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we are creating trust in the data sets and the models and the outcomes of that is provided to us. Then in further iterations, as Matthew said, we can really dig down into the details. But if we start by digging into the details, I don't think we'll ever put something out or ever be able to move on. So I think that if we start in that end, that might be achievable. It might not be perfect, and some people or some organizations may still require further information than what we have specified for some use cases within sort of that category of use cases. And that's fine. We can sort of address that as we move along or adapt if we see that this is sort of a major drawback, but that might be one approach of how we move forward with this. And both from the perspective of what can we supply as when we are providing these, and what would we want when we are sort of receiving this. And sort of I certainly would want more information than I think anyone is able or willing to provide me when I'm consuming this. But what I'm gonna get is sort of probably a reasonable compromise of what can be realistically given out and what do I actually need, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, so what you said, I think is consistent with what you put in chat. And Alice, you said agree. I think were you agreeing to Jimmy's comment in chat, or was it something else?
I was agreeing about starting with simple, minimal set of things rather than a complicated one.
Mm-hmm. I'm on board with that too. I'm on board with picking a use case and then marching through a what the minimum set is from a delivery and receiving perspective.
I'm cognizant of the time. We have 20 minutes left today. What do we want to try and achieve in this time, and do we want to set some homework, or put this somewhere and let people add to it?
What do you guys think about this? So if we pick a use case, I like the one that someone suggested earlier as to an LLM, and if we just keep it simple, let's say it's a text-to-text LLM, and then maybe we take that and we work through the parameters of to me the Hugging Face example is a potential good one. Let me put that link in chat. So it should be in chat now. Okay, so if we look at that example and maybe march through some of those factors that are the elements of that proposed model card approach, maybe we can arrive at something more concrete. So concrete use case, concrete, mind example, using the Hugging Face approach. And by the way, there might be other approaches. I'm not saying it needs to be a Hugging Face. I'm open to other approaches, but I just happen to like this almost as a checklist of discussion topics. And then the mindset would be, what, to Jimmy's point, what do we supply when we deliver? What do we need when we receive? So I put that out there just as a test to see whether or not, we have consensus on that approach. And feel free to disagree, because, knowing that we don't have consensus is also important.
We've got some nods here in the room in Cambridge.
Okay.
I'm nodding vigorously to that as well. That makes sense as an approach.
Okay. All right. is Tiffany still on? Tiffany, if you're still on, I'd be interested in your view as well. And Alice is a thumbs up as well. See that.
Yeah, no, I agree with that approach. And I actually really like the Hugging Face model as well, as I find it more comprehensive than some others. And it touches on a lot of the aspects that I would like to see. So, and I agree with starting with a simple example. I think that's going to be the best way as well to walk through and say, okay, in a real world, what still would we like to see? And I think in that we're going to flesh out all the areas that even I think, Dave, I think you allude to this, that some of the ones that we think are like the minimal viable will still maybe very difficult for a provider to be able to answer that a recipient would want to see as well. So I think this is going to be a fun case study, law school hypothetical, if you will.
It does feel like that. Yeah. A good hypo. All right. Brian, Jeff, any thoughts from you guys as to this, direction that we seem to be converging towards?
I agree with everything that's been said.
Brian might be, running for a box of tissues or something. So, and I hope you're feeling better soon, Brian. Others on the call, I don't mean to exclude, others that have been, and I know we lost a few folks, at the top of the last hour and, recently, but, like other folks that, folks we've heard from and we haven't heard from. Okay. All right. It sounds like of the folks that I've heard from, we do have consensus, and if we want to do that, then let me grab that Hugging Face link and I'll put it in this slide as well. So then I realize that as I keep typing on this slide, things get smaller. So if I need to move to another page.
Why don't you start a new page, Dave, with next steps?
We shall do that. Let me grab a couple pieces here. Okay. Start with LM to text. First typo. Work through the interface part. That's here. And then focus on what, say, one supplies. So should I say what one should supply when delivering? And what? Succeed when receiving? Okay. Comments on this proposed, articulation of next steps?
What is the expectation, Dave, of you, me, people on the call between now and I guess the next study group meeting at this time zone is in 2 weeks' time, the 19th of March?
I'm not super keen on, assigning homework unless you are, Matthew. But I think if you look at this link and kind of just skim through it, it takes you all of 10 minutes to look at the link. Okay, and then for LLM, I don't know that we need anything more specific than an LM that's going to be text to text. There's many good examples out there. We can imagine that. Let's say we're doing I don't know, a fictional version of ChatGPT. I'll just say, how about this? Please review the example modifier. Does that work for you, Matthew?
Yeah.
Is there more? Yeah. Okay. All right.
Would
All
we
right.
modify some of the sections in the model card example back to our topics in the other slide?
Sorry, say that again, please.
If we want to tie back the sections in the model card example to these topics.
The sections in the model card example to
Not exactly mapped one-to-one, but we might want to do that.
Oh, are you saying that the model card might not capture, all the things we've talked about?
Vice versa.
Okay. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. There's categories around this stuff, that covers. Let's say so. Bias, risks, and limitations are in knowing who developed it, and if also who funded it. It's something that they're saying is an optional field. So that's in. The license is in. Security is not in. I don't see security as a piece on this list. Let's if I grab this and move this here and just say under for consideration. Let's move all this stuff. How about that? Then we preserve some of that thinking there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Great. I think we're possibly ready to close. Matthew, do you want to, any comments that you wanted to share with if we're at that point?
No, I think we've made good progress in the last nearly 3 hours. Good discussions at the start, and it sounds like we're starting to make good progress for next steps. Happy to keep this momentum going with kind of the next steps that Dave's got on the slide, and keen to progress, even if it is a minimum viable product. I think that starts building that trust in the ecosystem.
Yeah, thanks. Yep, and MVP is what Yari was mentioning in chat as well. Oh, I see that Rowan also said subcategorization of training data field to flag personal data / medical data. Oh, okay. I can add that. I can add that. And how about I put the bin right here? Personal. There's a lot more that we can fill in underneath these pieces. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sounds good, Rowan. I just want to thank everybody for the participation and joining the session. I feel like we had really good conversation on these issues, and I want to thank Brian for being a trooper. Even though he was obviously under the weather, Jeff, thanks for your discussion on data sets. I will thank Shane in his absence for hosting, and Matthew for his leadership. So thanks, everybody. I think we're at a wrap. And if anyone has reservations for any of this to be put on YouTube, then please let me know. Send a note. Thanks, Jimmy. Yep, appreciate it. Yeah, echo.
We'll meet again in a couple of weeks' time. And Dave, can you share these slides via Shane?
Yes, I'll send these to Shane so that he can, share these, not just the notes slides, but also the, but the slides that we presented today. Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Right. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.